Hi, thanks for joining us. This is our Old Testament survey, part of our Faith Bible Institute. And we are studying the book of Daniel. We are in the second part of our study this time. If you haven't seen the first part, you're more than welcome to jump back and view that. But if you want to just stick with us, we're going to do a good overview of the book today, and you'll be able to hang along with us, no problem. When we talked last time in the book of Daniel, we started to look over just some of the general things, some of the title. We learned that the title of the book is named after the main character, Daniel. We learned that historically it covers from the period of the Babylonian captivity when Daniel is taken away, and it goes all the way through about 67, 70 years later with the Daniel being under rule by the Medo-Persians, not by just the Babylonians. We learned that it was called the Apocalypse of the Old Testament. It's not just a prophecy genre, it's dealing with apocalyptic end times, looking at the distant, the far-off future, not just maybe the immediate future. And so we learned a lot about that as well last time. We learned that Daniel not only ministered in Babylon, but he was directly ministering in the palace. He ministered to many of the kings, many of the world powers, the major powers of the world during that time, whether it was Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, later on Darius. And so we see that he had a lot of influence in the world because of his faithfulness to God. One of the quotes that I put up last time, for those of you who remember, it was not by Johnny Appleseed, but it was by this man, Tremper Longman. He said that God gave us prophetic books to inform us about the future and to instruct us about the present. If you go with me to Daniel chapter 12, look in Daniel chapter 12 with me, and it's a really interesting verse that is highlighted there in Daniel chapter 12 about what Daniel was doing when he was told to close up the prophecy, to seal it up, to be done writing with everything. And the angel gives them some specifics as to why you're writing this. Notice what he says in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. It says, "But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase." What he's saying is, Daniel, this book is going to be very relevant and very profitable for people to learn, to be able to go back and forth in it, to learn and to gain, so that they can not only understand what happens or what will happen in the future, but also how to live even today in the midst of trials and difficulties and world calamities and all these different things that are happening to us. The book of Daniel is very relevant, very profitable for us. Now, as we pick up in our study last week, we're on page 66 of the notes. If you don't have notes and you'd like to get some notes, you can check the email from the church, or you can just write into our secretary, give an email or give a call, and we'd love to get you a set of notes if you would like those. But we're going to pick up, for those of you who have notes, on page 66 of our notes, and we're going to pick up with the language of the book of Daniel. Now, the language of the book of Daniel, when we're talking about literature and interpretation and understanding the book, it's interesting because Daniel is going to be written in two different languages. It's going to be written in Hebrew, chapter 1, and then chapters 8 through 12 are all going to be written in Hebrew. And then right in the middle, chapters 2 through 7, we're going to have an entirely Aramaic section. Aramaic was the common language during the day. The Jews would have spoke Hebrew, but they would have also learned to speak Aramaic. It was the common language. It was the trade language. It was carried over from the Assyrian Empire into the Babylonian Empire, into the Medo-Persian Empire, and even speaking Aramaic when the Jews were back in the land. So it was very much a common language spoken. In fact, most Bible scholars think that even by the New Testament, the Jews would have spoken three languages. They would have spoken their Hebrew language, Greek, which would have became the trade language, and Aramaic as well. So it was not uncommon. In fact, that might come up, and well, wouldn't it be really difficult and cause problems for people to have this book written in two different languages? Not really. See, people were adapting to their new Babylonian culture. In fact, that's what Jeremiah, if you remember back in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 to 14, Jeremiah tells them, hey, learn to live in the land, be profitable citizens, work hard and be diligent. And so part of that would have required them to learn the language. So it wouldn't have been difficult for them. As well, the people were okay with two languages. In fact, as you get to later on in history, the Jews, when they were translating the book of Daniel, they could have easily just translated the section of Aramaic into Hebrew. But they didn't. They left it the way that it was written, intended, and intentionally. So they didn't change it back because they were okay with the two languages. And it also allowed, I think, something very interesting. It allowed for the Babylonians as well to read and understand God's power and to see that God controlled the affairs of men. They were able to read and understand this section. I often wonder too, the wise men who came seeking Jesus. As they were reading, coming from these areas of Babylon and Persia, were they possibly reading some of Daniel and understanding the numbers and catching the addition and the math that was there and saying, wait a second, something should be happening, just like Daniel is going to do, as we'll see in a few minutes. Daniel reads Jeremiah and says, wait, 70 years are up. Something should be happening. I don't wonder if some of those magi, as they read Daniel's writings, understood, wait a second, these numbers are starting to line up. Something should be happening here. If Daniel's prophecies and all of his prophecies have come true, we need to pay attention. So just, some interesting dynamics there, but it wasn't a problem for the people. It's totally different for us. I remember going to a couple different countries, and one of the jokes that people often tell is, what do you call somebody who speaks two languages, bilingual, somebody who speaks three languages, trilingual? What do you call somebody who speaks one language? You call them an American. Because we don't, by nature, we don't tend to learn a second language because we don't have to. Everybody wants to speak English. But in that day, it wasn't a problem for people to speak two or three languages. They had to. So this isn't an issue as far as the people are concerned or people understanding Daniel's writings. They would have been able to hear it and understand what was being written. As we look at the book, though, I think there's a little bit more to why the book is written in two languages. Now, we always have to be careful to come down very concretely on something that is not concrete. So this adaptation, I actually saw it with a place called the Bible Project, and I really like how the flow goes, and I think there's some validity as to what happens in the book. And you may look and go, no, I think it's crazy. In fact, some people just look very simply and divide the book of Daniel into two sections, chapters 1 through 6, the historical section, chapters 7 through 12, the prophetic section. And I think there's a lot of validity to that because the book does break down that way. But why these two languages? Why the change in the middle? And is it not possibly, for the Babylonians, for the Gentiles, for others to be able to see that God is the one in control, not them? To see that God is going to be the one in the end who wins, not them. To crush their pride, to humble them, to say God is in control. And he has this section there. But let's just look at how it flows together and why I have these links there and everything. And let's just talk about it a little bit as we go through the book. You'll see in chapter 1 there, chapter 1 we have the introduction to Daniel, and then we're going to move to chapter 2 with the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, and then we're going to chapter 3, the fiery furnace. Chapter 4, you get Nebuchadnezzar's pride. You're going to have Belshazzar's pride in chapter 5. Chapter 6, trial of the lion's den. And then chapter 7, you're going to have Daniel's vision of those four kingdoms. So let's just talk through a little bit of the book of Daniel. Let's go back to chapter 1, and we're gonna plow quickly. I'm going to rest in your general understanding of the book of Daniel and some of the stories there. This is a survey class. In our Daniel classes, we definitely dive in more deeply. But here we're just going to hit some of the highlights. Notice in Daniel chapter 1, the first time and the only time the teenage boys ever refused food. After all those years of youth ministry, trust me, teenage guys, they love to eat. And so what happens here? We know that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are pressured to change their diet. They're being given the king's food. They're the choicest foods, the most sumptuous foods, and they realize that would be against the dietary restrictions that the Jews were under according to the Mosaic law. So they make the choice not to comply with that, even though it potentially meant death. They were willing to say, we're going to be faithful to what God has said. In that, they had the question to raise, and I think it's a legitimate question. Well, we're in Rome, do as the Romans do. While they're in Babylon, so do as the Babylonians do. Everyone else is doing it, and yet these men, these teenage boys said, no, we're going to choose to live the way that God desires us to live. So they make that decision, and they live the way that they're supposed to. And what happens is that we know that God graciously gives them the ability to stay strong, And then he allows them to rise to positions of authority and responsibility. They haven't ascended to the premier spots yet. We know that eventually Daniel will. But at this point, they're just going to be entered into the wise men's court to be able to be part of the cabinet or the council to Nebuchadnezzar and the government officials there. And that's all that chapter 1 really introduces us to. How did Daniel get into Babylon, and how did he get into the position that he got into? We get to chapter 2, and they're now in that position of being a royal vizier or advisor. And they're in that position. And chapter 2 is where we switch to Aramaic. So now we're going to talk about all the things that are happening in these pagan cultures, these pagan kingdoms, these world powers, but we're going to do it in the common language, speaking in Aramaic. Chapter 2, as many of you are aware, is where King Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a dream. He's going to demand of the wise men to interpret the dream, and not only interpret the dream, but reveal the dream as well. Whether that was a test to say, are you really a wise man? Or Nebuchadnezzar forgot the dream and he couldn't remember, but it just was really upsetting to him, we're not sure. But we know that he says you have to do both. And the wise men are like, we can't do this, we can't do this. Daniel comes in and says, okay, king, give me a little bit of time, and I'm gonna help you with that. Because they had all been placed under that death sentence. They were going to be put to death because they could not reveal and interpret the dream. Daniel is going to be able to identify and interpret the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And what I did was I gave you, in the back of the notes there, I gave you a section here that is from Pastor Burgraff's series on the book of Daniel. And on the one side, you'll see the statue drawn. It's going to reveal and talk about the kingdoms in the middle. And then we're going to get to later on into Daniel 7, where we'll talk about those kingdoms as well. I'll refer back to this just briefly. But those are there for you to peruse through, to have and to understand what is all being talked about. The head of gold, the chest of silver, the belly and the thighs of brass, and the legs of iron, and then the clay and iron mixed in the feet, and then the stone that's going to be hewn out of the side of the mountain without even hands, and it's going to come and crush all those kingdoms, and there's going to be this eternal kingdom that's going to be set up. All of that, the deep prophecies and understanding that vision, is for another time, but we know that through this chapter, we know that the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. And that literally goes to his head. Because as we get to chapter 3, we're going to find that, what happens at the end I have there, at the end of chapter 2, Daniel's going to be promoted because of his ability to highlight that. And if you notice at the very end of chapter 2, down in verse 49, Daniel made the request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. So you have these 4 men who have been faithful to God, are continually to be raised into these positions. Now, please don't read into that and say, well, if I'm faithful to God, God must raise me into positions. He doesn't. He may. But when you're in those positions and God has put you in those positions, live your convictions and live righteously so that God can continue to bless and minister through you in those situations. So at the end of chapter 2, Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar's all excited, and we see that come out in chapter 3. So you have the vision of Nebuchadnezzar and these 4 kingdoms that take place. Into chapter 3, where now Nebuchadnezzar, verse chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. The height was 60 cubits. It was 60 cubits wide. It was in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. I mentioned last time, read through chapter 3 sometime and look at the number of times it says that Nebuchadnezzar did this, or Nebuchadnezzar sent this, or Nebuchadnezzar. You're going to see it come up time and time and time again. Because Nebuchadnezzar's pride is swelling. His head is getting very big. Because he is, at this point, the world's most powerful ruler. He's a tyrant. He is the despot. Nobody goes against Nebuchadnezzar. No one. And so he's in that position of ultimate authority and power. So he erects this statue of that is there. And his pride is going to be highlighted. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as many of you know the story, are not going to bow down. It was told when the instruments play, bow down. They refuse to. Word gets back to Nebuchadnezzar. He comes and says, is this true? He gives them that chance to bow down and do it again. And they're like, no, we're not going to do this. You know, they say, verse 9, O king, live forever. O king, you have made a decree that every man who hears the sound should fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down, this is going to happen. They say there are certain Jews, so they highlight that this is going to happen. The people are trying to get these men in trouble. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to get to the point where he's like, all right. And his wrath, notice in verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar's wrath was filled with wrath. And his facial expressions was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times hotter. He's upset. You were supposed to do this. And remember, one of the reasons, who did they serve? This is a really interesting dynamic here. If you go back to chapter 1, in chapter 1, these men, verse 4, they were being trained, they were being groomed in this fine schools of Babylon to do what? For serving in the king's court, is what it says in chapter 1, verse 4. Now you go to chapter 3, and these men are standing before the one whom they serve, Nebuchadnezzar. And in chapter 3, verse 17, he says, they're responding to Nebuchadnezzar. If it be so, our God whom we serve. Nebuchadnezzar was the deity. Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He felt he deserved all service and fealty toward him. And now you have these 3 men who are going to not bow down, and they're going to look and say, the God who we serve, he'll deliver us, not you, king. His wrath is, it's infuriating. Well, I can't even say that word. There's an indignant wrath that is, he's angry. Heat it up 7 times hotter, make it worse. So much so that the people who are going to take them into the fiery furnace, remember what happens to them? Verse 22, they were so hot that it slew the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in. And so as they're chucked into the furnace, the guys carrying them in die. Because they're serving the king, they're doing what they're supposed to, but they die because of the intensity of the flames. And yet we know that through it all, God protects them. Because remember what Nebuchadnezzar says? He looks in. And he stood up with haste, and he responded in verse 24. And he looks and he says, whoa, wait a second. Verse 25, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like the sons of God. He's not saying, look, it's Jesus. He didn't know who Jesus was. Okay? Don't read back. But we can look back and understand that it was probably Christ walking in there with him, protecting his children. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't know, oh, there's Jesus Christ. He's just understanding that there is a divine being in there protecting those men. And they pull them out. They don't even smell like smoke. Nothing is singed. No hair is singed. And you know, if you've ever singed any hair, you smell that. There was no smell of anything on them. And Nebuchadnezzar responds. He says, blessed be God. God is going to be glorified. Sorry, let me get the right slide there. The faithful are going to be protected, and ultimately God is glorified. He says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, no one's going to speak anything offensive against their God. And this caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper, verse 30, in the province of Babylon. Again, you end with these men prospering, with these men being exalted because of their faithfulness to God through the book. So you get to the end of chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar eats crow a little bit, but he glorifies God in a small way, but it's not Nebuchadnezzar getting saved. And then you get to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another vision. He has another dream. And as he's having this dream, he was really wrestling. He was looking all over his lands. He's seeing how great everything is and how much he has created. And his pride is going to be highlighted, and the fall is highlighted through a vision where Daniel's going to interpret for him. He's going to see this great tree. And as he sees this great tree, it's going to be stripped of all its leaves. It's going to be chopped down. And around it is going to be put a brass band in the bottom of it to hold it together, to either preserve and protect it, or to to preserve and to protect it for the future. And Nebuchadnezzar sees it, and he doesn't understand what this is all about. So he calls in the wise men. Eventually he calls in Belteshazzar, which is Daniel. around verse 9 and 10, right in there. He calls him in. He says, can you tell me about it? What is happening? And what's interesting is this time Nebuchadnezzar remembered the dream. He told the dream to Daniel. And then Daniel is going to listen to it, and he's going to notice what is happening. And God, what he's going to do, he's going to break the pride of Nebuchadnezzar, and yet he's going to preserve him. It's still going to come forth. He's going to understand how Nebuchadnezzar responds to God. But look at Daniel's response. Verse number 19. Verse number 19, then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him. Not appalled like, oh, this is so gross. He was taken aside. He was taken back, and he's understanding what this is about. And Nebuchadnezzar even looks at him in that verse and says, hey, don't worry about telling me, if it's bad or good. Just tell me. You need to be honest with me. And it even seems to highlight that part of the appalling is the fact that I think Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel probably had a nice relationship. Maybe Daniel had grown in affection and loved Nebuchadnezzar and was respectful. He didn't hate him. He was not wanting to say what was about to happen. And Daniel's going to plead with the king when he explains it to him in verse 27 that you need to repent, you need to change, because what's he tell him is going to happen? You're the tree. You're going to be chopped down. You're this great kingdom. You're going to be set aside, and you're going to have this band put around you, and eventually what's going to happen is you're going to be like this wild animal that's going to go out in the fields, and you're going to act like the oxen. And you think about the power of the world being humiliated to the point of roaming like a wild animal, hair growing all over their body, eating the grass, just wandering around, almost like a zoo animal on the side. And that's where Nebuchadnezzar ends up. Daniel pleads with him, and he has the opportunity to respond. Look in verse 27. Verse 27, therefore, king, my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sin by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. In other words, change. Take the pride and be humble. Help others. Serve other people, not just yourself. And he doesn't, look how long. Look at the next verse. 12 months later, an entire year goes by. Nebuchadnezzar has the opportunity. All of Daniel's prophecies have come true. All of Daniel's interpretations have been faithful and been good. And now Daniel looks and says, do this. And he's like, yeah. And a year later, he's walking around, and look at his pride highlighted. He says, look, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built, verse 30, as a royal residence by my might of the power of the glory? He's probably overlooking the hanging gardens of Babylon and looking at the wondrous canals and infrastructure that he built in Babylon. And in that moment, while the word was in the king's mouth, verse 31, a voice from heaven comes saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty, your power, your might, your strength has been removed from you, and you're going to be driven away from mankind. And all this is going to happen, verse 33. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. All those things that Daniel said, he's going to be driven away. He's going to begin eating grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven. His hair was growing like eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. And whether it's a lycanthropy or something else that God just does miraculously for these years, it happens. And Nebuchadnezzar, after a time, after all of this takes place, years later, but at the end of the period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reasoning returned to me, and I blessed the Most High. And I praised and honored the one who lives. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. Of all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Nebuchadnezzar sums up what is happening here. He humbled me. I was proud. I need to be humbled under the mighty hand of God. Personal opinion, I believe we'll see Nebuchadnezzar one day in heaven. I believe that he came to a realization that it is God, not him. And I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And if you want to comment or argue with me and send something back, that's fine. It'd be a fun debate. But I truly believe that that's what we'll find one day. It was Nebuchadnezzar's pride that was humbled under the mighty hand of God. But look at how it played out. What brought him to that point where he would say at the end of verse 37 that I am humbled and God humbles those who walk in pride? Look at the response, the understanding of God from this man, probably from the years with Daniel, probably from his years now grazing in the wilderness or the fields. Look at what he says. Let's backtrack just a moment and see how God worked in Nebuchadnezzar's life and the understanding that Nebuchadnezzar had. If we're proud, if we're exalting ourselves against God, we're saying we're going to do things our way, we're going to do what I want to do. What can we say? What can we learn about our God? Look what he says. Verse 34 is where we highlighted already. But at the end of the period, Nebuchadnezzar raises his eyes toward heaven, and his reasoning returns to him, and he blessed the Most High. Remember, he saw himself as the Most High. Now he sees God as the Most High. And he praised and honored the one who lives forever. He understood he's now been moved to an animal status. He realizes his life's not in his hands. But the one who lives forever, his dominion is an everlasting dominion. Nebuchadnezzar's like, mine was easily taken away with a word. And yet God's dominion is forever. He said his kingdom endures from generation to generation. It's an eternal. It goes on and on and on. He highlights that all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing before God. Nebuchadnezzar is understanding and grasping the magnitude, the magnificence of God most holy, of God most sovereign, the one who is above all. He says, verse 35, he goes on, but he does according to his will, where? Not even on earth, but in the hosts of heaven. He's beyond me. He is above me. He is God. He goes on, he says, among the inhabitants of the earth, he does his will. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? Ooh, that is not a fun phrase to wrestle with. Have you found yourself? God, what are you doing? Why would you do that? Why would you allow this? Why would you allow these things to happen, God? Don't you see what's going on in our world right now? What have you done? Here's this pagan king who, as I mentioned, I believe is coming to an understanding of who God is, truthfully. What does he say? He says, I can't even question his ways. We can't say, what have you done? He trusts in God. At that time, my reason, it returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me. For the glory of my kingdom and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out, and I was reestablished, and my sovereign and surpassing greatness was added to me. Don't miss that verse as we finish up today. As we wrap up this section, and we'll keep going next time with the flow of the passage. Don't miss that. The most powerful, tyrannical, maniacal, amazing, all these, a lot of really big words can be thrown around with Nebuchadnezzar. He is proud. He exalts himself against God, and God humbles him. Nebuchadnezzar repents. And what does God do? He restores. What a beautiful picture of repentance and forgiveness. That God would forgive this proud, arrogant, worldly king. The one who took his people into exile. The one who ravaged the city of Jerusalem. Yes, at the hand of God. But he did all these things and saw himself as the one who did it. He asks for forgiveness. He humbles himself before God, and God restores and even adds greatness to him because he understood that he could handle it. Is that not encouraging? No matter where you're at, no matter what you've done, God forgives. God forgives and God restores. Pastor just went through it a couple weeks ago with Peter. That fallen believers can be fruitful once again. He restored a man like Nebuchadnezzar from a very destitute place. And he can do the same for us. Next week, we're going to pick up and we're going to see how all of this starts linking together. How it links together with chapter 5 and 6, 7, and then into the prophecies. And we'll finish out the book of Daniel next week. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.